Welcome to another conversation between myself, Mark Vernon, and Rupert Sheldrake. Hi there, Rupert.
Hello, Mark.
Rupert, I was wondering about talking through organised religion, um, because it feels to me that in a lot of spiritual questing, um, organised religion is not quite taboo, but certainly is seen as detrimental to the personal quest. And of course, we live in a country, the UK, where organised religion is certainly in the form of the Church of England in decline. And, organised religion around the world is often linked to all manner of ills and conflict and trouble. Maybe there's something about the ideal of the free individual that so powerfully dominates in the West linked into all this as well. But it feels like, well, let me put it a bit more personally as well, because this is something which we both have a personal connection to. I used to be a priest in the Church of England. And I remember the night before I was ordained, I went to see the bishop who was going to ordain me, who was David Jenkins. Back in the 1980s, was sort of famous, even Bishop of Durham, a time when bishops could make headlines quite easily in England. And I said to him, I don't know if I should be ordained. I feel very ambivalent about this. I don't even know what I feel about the church. And he said two things to me. One thing he said was, don't take yourself so seriously, which is a phrase that's resonated with me, because the great risk of the personal quest is that you end up taking yourself very seriously, when a lot of spiritual teaching would be to get over yourself. You can get caught up in yourself with the personal quest. So that's a thing that I've wrestled with. But the other thing he said was, look, when it comes to the church, I agree, you can't live with it, but you also can't live without it, because for good and ill, these institutions, organizations are the carriers of the wisdom of the tradition. They're the means through which things get transmitted and, keep these things alive, which is really important too, because these spiritual traditions aren't just things you can read from a book, but they have to be known as felt, lived experiences, with the wisdom having that kind of flexibility to meet the moment that's appropriate, rather than just as if it's a code or a kind of formula. So look, that's all to say, this is something which I felt very personally and continue to wrestle with. I do feel very mixed about the church, whereas I think you feel a bit differently from that.
Yes, well, I spent quite a long time on a kind of spiritual quest mode, through psychedelics, through meditation, which I did first with transcendental meditation. Then, when I was living in India, in Hyderabad, I had a Sufi teacher and did Sufi practices. And yes, so I tried sort of various spiritual practices, but I personally find organized religion has, an enormously important role to play. I'm sort of pro-organized religion on the whole. I know, as you say, it's kind of taboo. Lots of people say, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious, and I'm Christian, but I'm not in favor of organized religion or the church or something like that. So it's generally considered taboo and has a very negative rating in most people's minds. Sometimes that's coupled with a kind of historical sort of thing about the Inquisition, imperialism, and so forth, which shows that Christianity and other religions can be abused for purposes of power, tribal loyalty, etc., easily hijacked. That's undoubtedly true. Of course, it's also true that atheism can be an immensely destructive force when it's politically powerful, as shown by the Soviet Union under Stalin, China under Mao Zedong, Cambodia under Pol Pot. I mean, these were some of the most murderous regimes in history and makes the Inquisition look like a vicar's tea party. These are incredibly destructive, and the French Revolution, the Reign of Terror, an anti-Christian movement of extreme viciousness. So no one comes out with any credit if you're looking at institutions of any kind. But at least in Britain at the moment, organized Christianity is so weak. I mean, only about 5% of the population go to church regularly, and a majority say that they're not Christian or have no religion. So it's not exactly in a very powerful position where it's dominating everyone's lives with rigid dogma. What's dominating people's lives with rigid dogma at the moment is science, which has become a very dogmatic force in our society. So I think a lot of these historical concerns are not terribly relevant today. What is relevant, I think, is the role of local communities, churches as local communities. I've just recently read a book by Alison Milbank called The Once and Future Parish, about the role of parish churches. And here in Britain, every village and community has a parish church at the centre, and it used to be the centre of the community. And in many places, it still is, because in many villages in England, the pub has gone, the school has gone. Almost everything, the only thing left is the parish church. And in some parishes, there's now one priest for 12 villages or even more. And the churches may have one service a month, mostly attended by quite elderly people, a handful of elderly people. So there's a real threat to the survival of parishes in Britain. Some managerialist bishops want to sort of get rid of them and think they're not cost effective and so on. But others, like Alison, think that these are immensely precious. They're the centres of a community where people have been married and christened and buried for centuries in many cases. And if that goes, and if they're sold off and become second homes for interior designers from London or something, this would not enrich the community. It would not enhance local life. It would impoverish it greatly. So I think there's a sense in which, unless we value this tradition, we'll lose it. It's a use it or lose it situation, not a struggle against overwhelming power and dogmatism, as some atheists like to think of it, but something where there's a very valuable tradition of beautiful buildings, dignified liturgy, wonderful music in our cathedrals, holy places, which I think are valuable for all of us, even for people who never go there. It's the very fact they exist is important, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I completely get that as someone who is readily charmed by particularly a rural parish church where the past mingles with the present, and beautiful architecture that lifts the soul, not just serves some practical utilitarian function. And then if you do hear some music, in a great cathedral, you do feel transported to another world, which I guess to many of our ancestors was much more immediate. Whereas for now, it feels like an exception, not the rule. So I do completely understand that. And, we've talked about things like pilgrimage before, the value of sacred place, lighting candles, these kind of practices. And, it is very powerful to go to even a modest country parish church, which maybe hasn't actually even had a service in it for quite some time, and yet still feel the presence that exists there. And so a building that holds that presence, I completely get is, immensely valuable, and once lost, is very hard to replace, because that presence is held because of the kind of accretion of generations of devotion and worship and recognition and so on. You may have a sacred well, or maybe the site of a saint's cave or some other link that keeps that thin place open. to the spirit. But there's something about the soul of the country that is held in these places. Incidentally, another little signal of how bad things have got in the UK is there was recently some research out I saw that showed that whilst for nearly every other place on earth, if you're religious, it's good for your well-being. That link is often made that a sort of spiritual sensibility seems to be correlative to a sense of happiness even, but certainly a sense of well-being. Apart from now in the UK, where being religious now seems to be, at least according to this one survey, who knows quite, but does seem to be detrimental to your well-being. And I guess it's because of this powerful sense now that if you're Christian, probably it's going to be Christian, you might well feel kind of cut off or alienated from the wider culture, or maybe a bit cast adrift, not quite sure how to pursue this conviction anymore. So I do understand the dire sense of things, but maybe also to, you talk there about sort of managerial bishops, and I've met one or two, and I wonder whether part of the trouble is not just the wider society becoming uncoupled from church life and pursuing a very secular course, but is because the church too has rather lost touch in its current manifestation with what would have been held in these older buildings, and hence the move to managerialism, the sort of obsession with numbers, quantity over quality feels to me always to be a sign that the spirit and the soul is being lost touch with. And whilst if you ask any bishop direct, are you becoming secular? Of course they would say no, but there does feel to be quite a secular spirit around, and even in the churches that are doing well. And it's a subtle business though. I don't want just to sort of pick up easy sticks to bash the church, because I feel that one of the ways it can get sort of smuggled in is by very powerful moral concerns that churches now have. And even, wanting to build community can take on a distinctly moral hue. It's about fending for those that don't have so much or get left behind by the state in the local community with things like food banks. And the difficulty is that clearly that is a good concern to have, and churches as a sort of network of charitable activity does a lot of good. So I'm not saying that that's not worthwhile, but it feels to me there's always a risk that concern for the here and now and secular concerns, which are very powerful and demanding, answering to be met, nonetheless mean that people lose touch with the wider concerns. And so a kind of flatland spirit can spread through the church. And then maybe there's a slight shadow side to this too, because I think Christianity, church's relation to the state in the West anyway, has always been quite closely linked to churches saying to the state, look, you need us because we can do things that the state can't do, like looking after people, building civic concern and so on. And so the difficulty is that clearly is a good thing, but maybe particularly when the church feels stressed, it gets it sort of eclipses a more spiritual vitality, so that even clergy don't even quite know what that is. Again, my sense is if you ask a minister, a priest, do you value spiritual life, of course they would say yes, but whether there's really a felt and living sense of that dimension of existence in their ministry, look, this is purely anecdotal, just my experience, but I put it this way, if people are serious about their spiritual journey, going to a clergyman is probably not going to be high on their list of places to go. They're going to go to a Buddhist monk, or they're going to go to a Sufi source, say. They may well, look at Christian mysticism and do pilgrimage and so on. But I feel that must be part of the problem, that the churches as a place of spiritual development, say, rather than just touching a sort of vague remembered sense of spirituality. That feels like it's got lost, and that's sort of somehow spread abroad as well, so that people don't even think that the church, organized religion, has much to do with their spirituality, and so might also be antithetical to it.
Mm. Well, I'm speaking personally. I make a practice of going to church wherever I am on Sundays, usually to the morning service, sometimes to evensong, or both. And I find it really helpful to do that, and especially when I go to village churches. There are often, not many people. They're quite elderly. They don't all have the same point of view, and I'm sure if you quiz them in detail about how they understand the creed and so on, you get a wide diversity of opinions. It's not as if everyone's got a uniform, doctrinally orthodox view, and they're not all going there because they're totally committed to every doctrine of the Christian tradition. They're going because it's a community, you sing together, you have an uplift, inspiration, receive Holy Communion if it's a communion service, you have a blessing. And it's part of a week, the rhythm of the week. And I find starting the week with a blessing on a Sunday is a wonderful way of starting the week, much better than just reading depressing Sunday newspapers. So I think part of it for people is simply not necessarily as part of a deep personal spiritual quest that they take very seriously, but just part of the rhythm of life. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think that's a really important part of life, to giving a spiritual dimension to life and to community. And I take your point about you wouldn't necessarily go and ask a priest for spiritual advice. I think this is partly because as a result of the Reformation here in Britain, we've lost what the Roman Church calls the religious. In the Roman Church, monks and nuns are called the religious. They live in religious orders. They're specialists in prayer and meditation and in leading dedicated spiritual lives. Whereas parish priests are called secular priests, not because they're secular in the modern sense of secular, but because they're to do with sort of ordinary everyday life, births, marriages, deaths, regular services, festivals in churches. And you see this in very strikingly in India too. The temple priests, the Brahmins who learn the chants, the Sanskrit chants, who conduct the pujas in the temples, are not people most people would go to ask for spiritual advice. They're officials, they're temple officials who conduct the proper rituals in the proper way. If you want to go for spiritual advice, you go to a sadhu, a holy man, who might be living in a cave in the Himalayas wearing orange robes. And it's a different role. And in the Roman Catholic Church before the Reformation, England was full of monks and nuns, hermits, all sorts of people who, at St. Julian of Norwich, for example, in her cell in Norwich, where people would go and ask for her blessing, they weren't going to ask the parish priest, they were going to ask Julian. And so I think that in Protestant countries, too much role is given to the priest, who's meant to be now both a kind of monk and spiritual leader and mystic, as well as an official running regular services and keeping the whole system as a kind of official presiding over a regulated system. So I think that's expecting too much. So I don't have a very high expectation of priests being necessarily illuminated figures but I do expect them to do a good job in taking a service according to the liturgy and being able to carry out a good wedding or a funeral, and that's their role for the most part. And I'm glad they do it. I think we need these things. We need rites of passage. We need regular uplift and so on. And I think we'd be poorer without it. So I myself I don't think that the whole of my spiritual life depends on a Sunday service in a parish church or choral evensong on a weekday in a cathedral. I meditate, I pray every day at home, I fast during Lent. I have a range of spiritual practices, but I don't expect all of them to come through the church. But I do think the church is very valuable because it gives us a dimension, a social and community and local dimension to spiritual life. So people who are spiritual but not religious have the personal spirituality, but it's uncoupled from sacred place, from the sacred liturgical calendar, the festivals, the seasons, the local community. And so I don't think it's either or. I think it's both and.
Yeah, no, I can completely see that, and maybe this is a critique of the personal pursuit of spiritual life, that is actually not just a cheap critique. Sometimes priests will stand up and say, modern spirituality is very narcissistic. It's just about the individual and their well-being, and they don't care about the ethical implications and so on. I think that's actually cheap and not accurate. But what I can see is that the much wider embodied practices, pulse of the year, of time, and so on, as you're saying, and the business of being with others and feeling, either consciously or not, that shared endeavor that is both in the present but also reaches back through time. That speaks to a much fuller sense of our humanity, rather than being a sort of isolated individual pursuing something. I mean, just last night, actually, I went to a talk given by a Tibetan monk, and he said many true things about meditation and about suffering, and led us through a brief Tonglen meditation, where you breathe in difficulty and breathe out light or love. And it was very lovely to do in that moment, and you felt the truth of it. But then he also told a bit about his personal story, and he'd been a monk for many years, and it included very extended retreats, like a 4-year retreat at one point. And he talked about how in that 4-year retreat, after about 10 days of it, he had a complete breakdown. And for 2 years, he said, was in a sort of state of disarray. God knows what that was like. Again, it makes deep psychotherapy look relatively mild by comparison. But it made me wonder, what is it in that time that kept him going? I presume it wasn't just his personal meditative practice, although presumably he had to sort of keep at that. But presumably it was the rituals and the rites, the pulse of the day, all what can look like quite extravagant paraphernalia of Tibetan Buddhism, that linked him to a source. I mean, I don't suppose a Tibetan Buddhist would put it quite like this, but to a source that was greater than himself. So sometimes, at talks like that, I do wonder what's not being talked about in this discussion of meditation. And maybe even I don't know whether, because meditation, as a serious practice, has been around for quite a few years now, quite accessible for quite a few years, a generation or two. But I don't know whether there'll be a moment where people realize you need more than just the technique, more than just the discipline to do it once or twice a day, partly to sort of keep at it, but also because only then does it speak to the fullness of our humanity, which of course is transpersonal as well as just individual and personal.
Yes. Tibetan meditation, of course, happens within a sort of larger social context, as you say. I mean, traditionally, there are lots of monasteries, or were lots of monasteries in Tibet. There are still Tibetan monasteries. So it's not isolated individuals on an individualistic quest. They're part of a community, and it's a fairly hierarchical community as well. And there, when I've been I was once working right on the Tibetan border of India in Lahul Spiti province, where it's culturally Tibetan. And the monks there were very involved in the festivals, the seasonal festivals, and, the whole liturgical year. So it was all tied into the whole society and the community and the celebration of festivals and so on. It wasn't an individualist pursuit. And in India too, the gurus who teach meditation are in ashrams, which are communities, and there are whole networks of people, and they're not separate from the whole temple system and the festivals. They celebrate the festivals like everyone else, and they visit the temples. And Sufis, the mystical branch of Islam, are here in England. They're some of them are it's like free floating mysticism. But when I lived in Hyderabad in India, where the Sufis there were, and indeed throughout the Islamic world, are first and foremost Muslims, and this is a kind of mystical dimension, but they still go to prayers in the mosque on Fridays and at other times. They still fast during Ramadan and observe the festivals and the ceremonies. So I think what we've seen in the West with spiritual practices, things have been plucked from their actual religious setting and treated as free-floating practices. When actually in their natural context, in their native context, they're part of a community and a religious tradition. So I think that's why I think it's important to learn from these traditions. I've written 2 books on spiritual practices, as you know, Science and Spiritual Practices and Ways to Go Beyond and Why They Work. Both of them deal with 7 different spiritual practices, of which meditation is one, gratitude's another, rituals are another, singing and chanting another, something I learned a lot about through my wife, Jill Peirce, who teaches singing and chanting. So I think all of these are enormously enriching and important, but I think they have to be grounded in this community, in this tradition. And so I don't think going to church is enough or alone enough. But I do think it's a really important part of this. And the tradition, especially of our great cathedrals and the wonderful music in them and the architecture they reflect, the vision they reflect, is hugely important. And also, of course, one of the traditional roles of Christianity is saving souls. Very unfashionable view today. But actually, I think it has some relevance, because one thing that's going on at the moment is a much more discussion of a possible afterlife than we've had for many years. I mean, near-death experiences, ways in which the end-of-life experiences, the passing over into the afterlife. Now, most people don't give it a second thought, but what if there really is an afterlife? What if when we die, we are in a kind of afterlife which I think of as like a dream world from which we can't wake up? Everyone agrees that dying's like going to sleep, but I suppose atheists think it's like going to deep dreamless sleep from which you never wake up. But actually, real sleep, if we use that analogy, involves dreams, and either all the time or some of the time when we're dead, we may be in a kind of dream world. And then it may really matter what happens. If you've prayed to Christ and the saints, maybe they can help you in the afterlife. If you haven't prayed to them, maybe you wouldn't think of asking for their help or protection. You'd be quite lost. In the Tibetan system, people who are unprepared for it find themselves in a bardo, an intermediate zone, which is utterly confusing to them. They don't know what to do. But those who've practiced, monks have these like dream yoga practice, like lucid dreaming, so they can navigate through the bardo and move into the light and be liberated through the light. They're prepared for the afterlife, and a lot about traditional Christianity is preparing people for life after death. A lot in the modern church doesn't emphasize this at all. You see Christian posters saying, we believe in life before death, trying to make it's about food banks and social justice and so on, which of course it is in part. But I think the preparation for life after death is an important part of traditional religion. And I personally take it very seriously. I pray the Hail Mary every day. And the bottom line of the Hail Mary is, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death. So I think preparing for death is really important. I mean, obviously it becomes more interesting as you get older. But anyone can die at any time, and people do die young and so on. So it's relevant to everyone.
Yeah, I mean, I too say, prayers like the Lord's Prayer and so on, and returning to those phrases, and partly as as an opening, as a petition, but also as a kind of a mode of self-reflection where you realize how you are in relation to death, or how you are in relation to, divine or other forces and entities, dynamics. That repetition has got to be important, and it makes me think too that part of the difficulty around organized religion in the West is a theological question, really, which is what vision of Christianity, let's just sticking with Christianity, lives in that church. I remember reading it's quite a well-known phrase by the Catholic theologian Karl Rahner, who makes this remark that the Christian of tomorrow will be a mystical Christian, or will not be a Christian at all, i.e. the mystical inner, esoteric, if you like, supernatural, although we've said before that's a tricky word, but nonetheless, that element is both inviting. It's why, as you're saying, interest in the afterlife never quite dies, and maybe is resurgent now, but also a kind of cultural longing. It's quite common to read literary figures saying, they don't believe in God, but they miss him. Or going on about how important Christianity is to the fabric of our civilization, and yet not quite knowing how to reconnect or remake that Christianity, because I'm sure it's not a nostalgic activity that's required. It's about understanding how it can live today. So that's a theological question, and I feel that again, the church has got very confused about this at a theological level, not just a moral level. And maybe this relates to what you're saying there about how in India the priests do one thing and the sadhus do another. That's really important, because it feels like a lot of church ritual has a kind of implicitly dualistic theology at its heart. That's like you sort of helpless before God and needing to somehow say the right kind of affirmation to receive that salvation of your soul. And it's administered through hierarchies in a rather pejorative sense. The priest, as it were, has the power to give the blessing, and you are rather passive before it. Or you're supposed to sort of, all your devotion is supposed to go towards a figure like Christ, who is somehow a perfection of humanity that you can never hope to know of your own account, because certainly since the Reformation, your inner life is utterly depraved, or as Calvin put it, or as Luther, has similar expressions, we can't trust anything of ourselves, and so we have to just trust the scripture, or trust something that's outside of us anyway, whether it be a church authority or a holy book. And I sometimes feel like the rebellion against organized religion is a rebellion against that kind of theology. And we need to recover a new kind of Christianity, which actually is old. We've talked a bit about wild Christianity and figures like Paul Kingsnorth and Martin Shaw and others who are becoming orthodox Christians, and figures like David Bentley Hart who speak from that tradition, and even actually, in the Church of England, Rowan Williams, deeply influenced by that tradition. And it feels to me there that the starting point is not you're a sinner at risk of hell in the afterlife, to go back to your point, but that you're an image of God, you're a portion of God. The divine is within you, And the invitation in this life is to know that more and more fully. That's the calling in this life. As church fathers put it, we're created to become uncreated. A notion of good news that's, almost too much to say, but not because it's terrifying, but because it's too tremendous. The promise there, the potential there is so extraordinary. Even if you're deeply spiritually inclined, you hardly dare say such a thing. And yet, I've written about this in books as well. I felt this was the significance of the person of Jesus in history, which I wrote about in one book, and then Dante's Divine Comedy as well, which I've written about. That I feel is what Dante finally realizes, is, as he puts it, his desire and will is now spinning like a perfect wheel with the love that moves the sun and the other stars. It's the realization that all that he hoped for and yearned for and fought against and struggled with in his own life was always the pull back to God, which was his source and origin. So a Christianity that can preach that genuine good news, not good news if you get it right, kind of salvation, and you're very at risk of getting it wrong. It feels that kind of theology is really important, but again, it's very tricky because it's not just about what a theologian might say, but it's embedded in the institution of the church itself, that kind of distancing hierarchy. So it's not a trivial concern, but vital, I think.
Well, I agree. I think that kind of message is what appeals to me, and I see it as at least implicit. Yes. Well, that's perhaps a good point to end. I mean, this is an uplifting vision, and one that I think is relevant to not only to us individually, but collectively. We're called to a transformation, and in the Orthodox Church, it's called theosis, becoming divine. It's so the emphasis much less on what's wrong and what's wrong with us and separated from God, but the process of moving into this divinization of humanity and of ourselves and us collectively. Then I think it's a truly inspiring vision. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, look. Thanks for teasing these things out. We see things slightly differently, but it feels like in that dialogue is a sort of a shared yearning, which is this fuller vision, which I'm completely with you, that I think Christianity has quite as much as any other great tradition. And I'm glad that we can at least touch it in our conversations, and hopefully, our listeners feel it as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Mark.